Good evening, everyone. Tonight is February 21st, 2024. This is a joint City Council and Planning Commission meeting. Our first order of action is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Would someone like to make a motion to approve our meeting agenda tonight?
This is Lynn. I'll make the motion to approve the meeting agenda.
And is there a second?
It's Rob, second.
I'll call for the vote, and I'll start here. Oh, do we all vote?
You all can vote on the approval of the agenda, yes.
Okay. Rob?
Rob, aye.
Janet, I.
Barb, aye.
Lynn, aye.
Sue, I.
Bethany, aye.
Ron, aye.
Robin, aye.
And Jesse, aye. Would someone make a motion to approve the September 2023 joint meeting minutes?
So this is Janet. I move to approve the September 20th, 2023 joint meeting minutes.
This is Lynn. I'll second.
I'll call for the vote.
Rob, aye.
Janet, I.
Barb, aye.
Lynn, aye.
Sue, I.
Bethany, aye.
Ron, aye.
Robin, aye.
And Jesse, aye. We're on quickly to public open forum. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak at public open forum? Or online? I don't see anyone, so we'll move on to a presentation and discussion of the cannabis business study. In our packets, it's pages 1 through 5, and then we had a new handout just before the meeting started. So Megan, I think you're going to lead this for us.
I sure am. Well, good evening, planning commissioners, members of City Council, Mr. Mayor. Earlier this year, or in the end of 2023, the council adopted a planning and zoning moratorium with regards to the development of cannabis retail outlets within the city of Columbus. And as is detailed in the memo that we provided in advance of the meeting, effective August 1st of 2023, sale and cultivation, manufacturing, and sale of adult use cannabis is now legal in the state of Minnesota. We adopted the zoning moratorium as a mechanism to study how it would have an impact within your existing zoning ordinance and to better understand the work and the rulemaking that is coming out of the Office of Cannabis Management at the state level. So historically, for high-potency hemp edibles that have been legal and utilized on the market, those have been regulated by the Office of Pharmacy. And that regulation has now transferred to the Minnesota Department of Health for the hemp edibles, but then will ultimately come underneath the Office of Cannabis Management as it gets up and running. So our conversation tonight is really an overview of what we know the status is of the existing legislation, what the rules and regulations are, and how you are limited as a municipal entity in terms of regulating these types of uses, and then talking about sort of a timeline for the changes to the code that we'll be seeking your guidance on from a policy perspective in a couple of areas. Number one, in the zoning ordinance, where you will permit retail cannabis businesses, whether you desire to see performance standards for agricultural uses, including manufacturing around cannabis uses, and then lastly, an update to your fee ordinance that will ultimately come to council with regards to the work that the city staff will be doing to oversee local licenses that are issued by the Office of Cannabis Management, but will be the work of it will be done by your staff here. So we will move through our presentation, and I'll just give you sort of a background on what we know to date. So the cannabis bill is known as Chapter 63 HF number 100. It creates the Office of Cannabis Management. It licenses and outlines the types of licenses that are permitted within the overall cannabis structure in the state of Minnesota. It creates sort of restrictions around where cannabis is used. Now, cities very quickly after this came, when cannabis was permitted by state law in August, moved to adopt ordinances, and you did the same thing, which restricted the use of cannabis within your public parks and on or around public buildings. And that ordinance has already been adopted by the council as a change to your parks ordinance. Some of the other regulations that are found within the bill are around the use of cannabis in multifamily buildings. The city is looking forward to having its first multifamily structure in the next 2 years. Cannabis will not be able to be used may not be smoked or vaped within any multifamily building throughout the state. And then it also contains regulations and limitations on the number of licenses that are issued. So we'll talk a little bit about the requirement, which I've mentioned in our conversation around the moratorium itself, which is that each city is required to have one retail business unless the county has provided for a higher number of retail businesses based on population count. We'll look at that in detail. But the other component of this is that licenses are going to be restricted in number by the state. They're going to be issued based upon a point and scoring system, and there are certain preferences that are outlined in the legislation, which I did bring here with me. It's 155 pages, should you wish to review it. Otherwise, we typically would attach something like this to your packet, but I thought perhaps that was maybe a longer-term project that we could look into. And so, in the context, I think when we think from a policy perspective of how this is going to roll out, the state sort of structure and the way the legislation was adopted is designed to encourage the development of retail stores. It's also designed to encourage and create a slow growth system for both manufacturers, for producers, for farmers, and then also for retail shops. So it's not as though there are an unlimited number of licenses that will be issued by the state. So you'll be restricted not only by the work that you all do and the structures that you put around the license, but also is generally restricted at this point in time by the legislature as well. So moving on to sort of recent updates from the Office of Cannabis Management, they got off to a bit of a rocky start. They hired an executive director from the cannabis industry who very quickly resigned her position. Hiring for the executive director role is still ongoing, and it has been expanded or augmented to a national search. So that is still in process. But one of the interesting things, so each month the Office of Cannabis Management is now producing a newsletter that's talking about the work that they're doing. That's available on their webpage. If it's something that you're interested in, it's a quick read. But one of the things that they found is that they did a study on existing users of cannabis within Minnesota. And what they found is that compared to other legal Midwest states like Michigan, Missouri, that people who typically use cannabis use more of it than people in Michigan or Missouri, which, in the words of the Office of Cannabis Management, suggests a robust market for cannabis-related businesses within the state of Minnesota. 83% of qualified participants, so those are people who have used cannabis in the last year, consume it at least once a month, and 40% consume it almost daily, or daily or almost daily. 25% report cultivating cannabis at home. So the existing law allows individuals, homeowners, renters to grow up to 8 plants at home. That's existing today. You can buy the seeds. The seeds are actually regulated by the Department of Agriculture. 25% of people who are users of cannabis today in the state of Minnesota from the sample population grow about 2 cannabis plants at a time for their own use. And over 50% of the sample reported at least using at least one alternative cannabinoid, there we go, which are those hemp-derived products within the past month, and 68% indicated that they used those previously to cannabis being legal in the state of Minnesota. Currently, of those users, almost 20% still receive their cannabis from a dealer, which I think is just an interesting fact. The 16% receive it from friends and family or an adult use dispensary, which could be a low potency hemp edible like Nothing But Hemp. That's a producer that is fairly close to Columbus, or of course, growing it at home. So those are the updates. That's the sort of the data that the Office of Cannabis Management is collecting. Over the course, so the way the legislation is structured is that all of the rulemaking for OCM is supposed to be done by January 1st of 2025. Now, of course, it is only February, but that's not that long to do rulemaking for a 155-page piece of legislation. One of the, according to our legislative affairs team, we understand that the OCM is going to bring before the legislature a revision to the bill that allows them to issue licenses for growing this fall, with the idea that then they will have product to go to market effective on January 1. So with this sort of timeline in mind, I think it's important that we adopt a timeline for how we are going to implement the zoning ordinance changes that are permitted by the law, and make some decisions about the type of retail license that potentially the city will be issuing. So that's our overall timeline in terms of rolling out legal cannabis retail shops and, of course, growers and manufacturers within the state of Minnesota. We talked a little bit at the beginning of our conversation of the different licensing types. We've included that in the memo, and I've included the licensing fees because part of what the city is going to be charged with is sending your code enforcement staff out or sending your planning and zoning staff out to confirm that the business that's applied for a license, and there's this long list of licenses, complies with the local zoning, land use laws, and that their building is code compliant for the work that they're doing. The micro and meso businesses are the only types of businesses within this licensing structure that are permitted to grow, produce, manufacture, sell, and facilitate the use of, so on-site, so sort of like a brewery, right? When we think about the distinction between a brew pub, which is a restaurant that serves specialty beers and food, that's a brew pub license that's issued by Department of Alcohol Consumption. Then there's the brewer's license, and the brewer's license, if you might recall, a number of years ago when they were looking at breweries and distilleries, there was a lot of conversation about the amount of beer or the amount of alcohol produced, and that tier, the type of license that they were eligible for, whether they could sell it to be consumed off-site, to be consumed on-site. And the proposed licensing structure for cannabis is very similar. So the term that's utilized to describe the scope of how much you can produce is the canopy, and the licensing type limits the scope of the canopy, how many plants you can produce, whether it's inside or outside, whether it's what growing system you're operating under. So our micro and meso businesses, they do all the things. They produce a small amount. If you're a micro business, you're producing a small canopy of cannabis, you are manufacturing it on site, and then you are selling it to users directly. Our manufacturers, cultivators, cannot do that. They do the work of growing it, of manufacturing it, and then they can sell it directly to a retailer or a wholesaler. So that's sort of the scope and the interrelationship of those different types of licenses. The city will be approached by the Office of Cannabis Management to determine whether a potential new low-potency hemp edible manufacturer is opening within the city, whether it's an approved use, has obtained a CUP within the district that that's located in, all of those things. And so for that reason, we can think constructively about all of these different licensing types also as uses that you may want to consider incorporating as definitions within your zoning districts, within your commercial zoning districts for those retail uses, within your industrial zoning districts or light industrial zoning districts for manufacturing, and then potentially for cultivators within your rural residential district to think about what that would look like. One of the things that is contained within this 155 pages are very specific restrictions for cultivators in terms of what security mechanisms they need to have for growing cannabis outside, for growing cannabis in greenhouses, the type of fencing that is required, the type of security cameras that are required. And that's one of the ways that I think we can constructively talk about some of the zoning implications and the appropriate time, place, and manner restrictions for potential, large-scale manufacturing or cultivating, to think about what fits within your districts. And if you have 8-foot security fences with significant lighting and security cameras, is that consistent with your overall sort of agricultural uses that you have in place today? And so that's really why those licensing categories matter. You also get, as part of the licensing process that the city will be engaged in, to charge a fee that is either up to $1,000 or half of what the initial license fee is and half of what the renewal license fee is. And so we'll be incorporating those fees into your fee structure should you be in the situation of doing that work. And of course, whenever we're talking about licensing and fees, we want to ensure that the fee is consistent with state law, which is sort of what we've outlined here, but it's also consistent with the actual costs that the city is undertaking to do the work. So under our, there's sort of a division. Many times when a regulatory structure is rolled out, it doesn't have an impact on what you choose to do, how you choose to license something as a city. A good example of that is the existing hemp and edibles market. Many cities have elected to license those and have very high, I think the city of Woodbury, it's $10,000 for an edible retail license. And that has proven to be an approach that some cities have taken with regards to those types of retail sales. However, the legislation explicitly prohibits the city of Columbus or other cities from having its own licensing category for these uses. So the state issues the license, we do not issue a license. If we had a general business license, we would issue that as we would issue it to any other licensee or business operator within the city. Similarly, there is a requirement that each city have at least one district and at least one location where a retail store may operate. There is a caveat to that, and that's that if Anoka County and other cities within Anoka County issue one active license per 12,500 county residents, the city is not obligated to register any additional cannabis businesses. And so, a lot of this, I think, is a demand question of, are people going to be pounding on the city's door to get a license for the retail use? And what we would suggest the solution to this is that the legislation specifically authorizes the city to restrict that retail use to one outlet, and then build into your ordinance where you make that restriction that no license would be issued. If this is the direction of the council, no license would be issued if more than the required number of licenses has been issued countywide based upon language in the legislation. So that's, I think, the sort of starting point. The city must issue a retail registration to a cannabis retail business so long as they have that valid conditional license from OCM, that they've paid their registration fee to the state, that they're in compliance with all of the state laws in terms of the compliance checks. And just like with alcohol, there will be significant background checks and other protocols in place for these types of licenses. And then they also have to be current on all property taxes and special assessments. So if there are any issues with the existing buildings, connection to water, sewer, compliance is required as part of that. The things that the city can do, so we talked a little bit about what the city cannot do. The city can put reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on the operations of both retail and production facilities. The city can collect fees as determined by state law, so that's that licensing matrix and the percentage of the license that you can collect. It can limit the number of the licensed retailers, which is our one per city. And it can also limit cannabis pop-up events. So this is something that was interesting that I don't think has really been covered very much in the press. There is a cannabis pop-up license designed to for people to throw up to 4 cannabis-themed events where smoking is allowed on-site or is just like a pop-up sale, sort of like a cannabis farmer's market. The city does retain the authority to put reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions around those types of events to require a special event permit, and you can also restrict smoking on site during the course of those cannabis pop-up events. And there's probably some analysis that we would do in terms of making that ordinance revision with regards to your existing special event licensing around, the appropriate First Amendment protocols that we need to follow whenever we're thinking about restricting people from gathering. But that was something new to me as I was putting this together, that there's this pop-up license where vendors will go from city to city hosting sort of these cannabis fairs. And then lastly, the thing that the city can do is collect and benefit from taxes. So one of the significant policy considerations that the legislature points to when they're talking about why this is good policy for the state as a whole is that in states where cannabis has been adopted, there are hefty taxes associated with the sale and manufacturing of cannabis. They have, states and associated school districts in Colorado and Michigan have really benefited from the additional dollars that have come into state coffers related to the sale of cannabis. And the way that the legislation outlines this, 80% of the total sales taxes related to cannabis use will go to the state of Minnesota. 20% will go back to the cities. To local governments. That 20% is split 50-50 between the cities and the counties. And then beginning in tax year of 2024, the total available aid statewide will be based on the number of cannabis businesses located in each city as compared to the number of cannabis businesses in all cities. So if you don't have a cannabis business, you will not benefit from the local government aid pot. If you do, you will benefit from it. So that certainly is a policy consideration as you think about utilizing the authority that you do have underneath the legislation to make policy moving forward. Okay. So now I think we're getting to the interactive part of our conversation and less of me sort of just talking about all of this. So there's 2 slides at the back of this presentation. One talks about the code updates that we would recommend. It's there. I've really already covered them in our broader conversation. There's some additional authority that the state has added to this bill that allows you to revoke tobacco and liquor licenses if any of your existing licensees are engaged in the unlicensed sale of either cannabis or hemp products. And then there's the one quick other update as well is that we talked about how OCM is managing the cannabis side. Hemp is currently being managed by Department of Health. Hemp is currently regulated only through a free registration through the Department of Health, and then compliance with all of the sort of existing legislation about potency, labeling. We've seen those posters on the highway that have, which one is a gummy bear, which one is a hemp gummy, which one is a kid's gummy. You can't tell the difference. Those are prohibited in the state of Minnesota. You can't have gummy bears. They can't be child friendly. They can't have like happy bears on the outside of the packaging. They have to be separate and not intended to induce children to use them. So that's how the structure is currently set up. Hemp will move underneath OCM when it gets fully up and running as well. But I think the policy consideration for you tonight are a couple of things. So I've now said it, I think, probably 6 times. The legislation authorizes and requires cities to have one retail shop. An approach that is being taken by some cities and by some counties is to operate their own cannabis shop. So we have the model of municipal liquor in the state of Minnesota. Edina runs their own liquor shop. Wayzata runs their own liquor shop. Eden Prairie runs their own liquor shop. Those have been, some are successful, some are require a draw from the general fund, but they oftentimes can be an effective, sort of economic generator for the city. So that is one consideration for all of you to think about. And I have a sense that a council member here to my right perhaps has an opinion on that. So I'll turn it over for a conversation.
No, not really. I just, as you were going through it, I'm thinking of all the cities that have it, Lakeville, Elk River.
Yeah.
These are kind of a regular thing with the liquor, but different kind of thing we're talking about here. Maybe not, but that's up to everyone's opinion, so.
What do you mean when the city owns it? Do you mean they actually open a business?
Absolutely. Yeah, please.
It would be just like the municipal liquor stores. And there's many examples of even the smaller communities around us that do that. St. Francis has one, Sandy has one, Cambridge has one. Those are the 3 that come to my mind right off the bat. So, and these can be big money makers, but they also can be big problems too.
In what way?
Well, it's the effective management of them, and you have to have a good store manager, you have to retain employees. Many of the problems that come from these now are the fact that they claim they're having problems getting people to work, just like everybody else is, retaining employees that will work in these.
Oh.
It's a challenge either way you go about it, so.
So the process that we're seeing cities and counties utilize is convening a task force to study whether or not they desire to move forward with opening their own store, looking at what the operational costs would be, where you would locate it, whether or not the city has the existing assets to purchase a building for its operation, doing some of those operational study, that would be the sort of next step if that was something that the council was interested in pursuing and learning more about.
And as Megan pointed out, one of the things that you'd have to consider if you wanted to go in this direction was to either find a building to lease or construct. You're going to have upfront capital to get started. I don't know. I don't think you have enough money in the budget, or you'd even want to allocate or think about that. So that would have to probably to be bonded for, or find a bank to loan you that. I don't know how favorable banks look at loaning money for a muni store for cannabis sales, but that's another consideration too in getting into the business yourself. Now, I've heard too that regulation of what goes on is easier if it's a city-owned operation, like things that happen in the parking lots, but I don't have any verification of if those are accurate statements or not.
I got a question, Megan. So a city has to designate one spot, or they can have their own, right? That so if you have your own, you get rid of that one spot.
Correct.
So does the city have to open it up?
So the city, I think that's probably to be determined in the rulemaking, but it certainly is implied in the legislation that that cities are specifically authorized to open their own retail stores, but that a retail store is required unless the county metric applies and the need has already been met.
I have a question. So we are required to have one. Can we have 2 or 3 or as many as we
Absolutely.
want? Or as many as get licensed through the state?
Absolutely.
Okay. I did have a couple other questions, not on that, but just some of the other things that you talked about. And I was thinking there was a limit on the number of licenses for the retail, but what you're saying is there isn't.
So the city will not have the authority to individually license any retail business. It can accept as many retail businesses as are licensed by OCM. OCM is capping the number of licenses that are going to be issued. So unless Columbus were to draw, abnormally 10 retail shops, or incentivize bringing those types of businesses to the city, it would be very unlikely, just based on the number of the number of licenses that will be issued statewide, that you would end up with a significant concentration, unless it was an intentional policy decision of the city.
Okay. How about is there a limit on the number of licenses for the other categories, the manufacturers and all
Yes.
those categories that are listed?
So I think it's important right now for medical manufacturing of marijuana, which is legal in Minnesota and has been for, I think, about 2 years now. There are only 2 licensed manufacturers. We do not know how many licenses will be issued, but based on that sort of past practice, we do not believe that there are going to be hundreds of these manufacturer licenses issued or hundreds of cultivator licenses issued. We feel like they are going to be fairly narrow, but we've heard no information and they've done no rulemaking on the number of licenses that will be issued for those types of uses.
Okay. The other question I had is, so it's legal to grow 2 plants or something, and you don't need a license for that?
No.
And we're not going to monitor any of that?
No.
It's only if they want to manufacture or get a license to do some selling and things like that?
Yes, any person in the state of Minnesota can grow up to 8 plants indoors. It must be kept in a locked space, but the city and the county, through its sheriff's office, cannot prosecute that possession unless it exceeds that 8 plant number.
Okay.
Or if it's not locked, or if if it doesn't meet whatever the rules are.
Correct. I think within the legislation, you see that there is a significant emphasis on the decriminalization of possession as well as use. And so I would say that, yes, the legislation requires for individual growers to maintain a locked premises for their 8 plants. I think the practical likelihood of prosecution of having an unlocked space is fairly limited in terms of the crimes that would be associated and charged. I think it becomes more a code enforcement issue as compared to a criminal issue.
And so if you ran into something like that, they have 6 plants growing amongst their sunflowers or something, and they're not going to lock them up, what do? Pull them up?
You call Sean.
We send out the mayor to pull up those noxious weeds?
That's right. Your noxious weed ordinance will come in handy.
You got a new job there.
Well, is it the Office of Cannabis Management? It says they develop the rules, licensing, and enforcement. Well, do you know yet what that entails?
Enforcement will be done at the local level.
Local mean state?
Us.
Oh, city.
City, state, and local police departments will be managing and really reporting and investigation of any license violations will be completed by city staff.
It seems like too much work for a city this size.
And so that's why those, I think one of our, whether you, the policy guidance that comes from these bodies is to implement and have a robust flexibility to allow for cannabis use and cannabis growers and retail uses, or whether it's to limit it to what's allowed underneath the legislation. We want to make sure that that fee, your fee schedule is updated to make sure that you're covering those costs, because it is going to require additional staff time.
So I have a question on, so like currently the medical marijuana is cash only? Is that, does that say anywhere in the rules if our retail or would have to be cash only?
At this point in time, we believe it will be cash only.
Okay.
The Office of Cannabis Management just released a study that I have not had an opportunity to review, but talking about sort of the financial protocols and, one of the, I think, safety considerations that people talk with regards the parking lots is that you're utilizing large amounts of cash, and so employees are taking large amount of cash out of the shop to the bank on a regular basis, and that creates potentially an attractive nuisance for theft of those dollars.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point in time, as we understand it, because of the broader federal prohibition on the possession and use of cannabis, that prevents banking, licensed federal banking institutions from taking on those dollars.
One of the other questions I had was on, so if we did have a retail operation, would we have to monitor online sales? Because potentially they could be selling to other areas that are not in a legal area.
So broadly, the license category, this was probably going to be flushed out, I think, in the rulemaking, but that you're required to sell for people to use in the state of Minnesota. It's a personal liability if they choose to take that product across state lines into, a state that does not permit the use, possession of cannabis.
Okay. Can you talk, oops, I just have one more, Janet.
That's okay. I was looking to see if you were still going to talk, and I just go for it.
So on one of your slides, you have a map, and you were talking about agricultural uses. So is that going to be for us to decide, like where the manufacturer, like where we're going to zone and allow?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. So the words that are pulled from the legislation are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on the use, manufacture, cultivation, and growth of cannabis. And as we get sort of more guidance about what those security protocols are going to look like, so right now within your rural residential district, agricultural uses are permitted. Now, very specifically, cannabis manufacturing and growing and cultivation are determined to be commercial and industrial uses. So they are not protected by the broader farm or the ag classification that we would typically see applied to local zoning ordinances. So with that in mind, you are not required to allow it within those districts. You are also allowed to put performance standards around if you have an existing farm that desires to move into cannabis, you can have performance standards related to that use. It could also be a CUP within your rural residential district. Those are some of the choices that you'll have to make in the next months.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that was it. So for now.
I can't believe that I have other questions than what you asked, but I do. So on page 3, it talks about, you know, the prohibition of these businesses within, you know, so many feet of a school and daycare and stuff. What about group homes? 'Cause we have a couple of those here.
Absolutely. One of the sort of recommended, the OCM is supposed to come out with a model ordinance, but we haven't seen that. And when we think about adopting a zoning text amendment, we're looking at a 120-day process, making sure that we have significant public engagement, which is why we're starting on this now, rather than waiting for the OCM to come out with their model ordinance. But yes, one of the suggested restrictions that the league has really been talking about is ensuring that there's prohibited retail, or prohibiting the retail use, you know, within 1,300, 1,320 is what St. Paul does of their group and care homes.
Okay, and then, so if we have I'm really kind of confused about the zoning part of this. So if we have a zoning district that prohibits retail, are they saying, too bad, so sad, you can't prohibit retail? I mean, if it just broadly prohibits retail or doesn't allow it, is this allowed under the state?
So the interpretation that our office has made, and I think is consistent with what many city attorneys are saying to their councils and their planning commissions, is that if retail is allowed within a district, then that would be a district where this type of use is allowed, so long as the definition, you know, is not limited to, you know, I think what is one of the things that we have in our CI Light district, it's like artistry, there's, you know, artisan shop. Well, this wouldn't necessarily fall within the definition of artisan shop. You all have taken a really significant look at your definitions. You know, if the size of the retail or the wholesale in terms of the performance standards was too large, that would be another restriction. So it would. It's a very long way of saying no. It is not permitted in non-retail districts, but if there are similar retail uses, it would be permitted, unless you adopt performance standards related to this specific use, which you are able to do.
Okay, and then, so I'm also confused about how the county fits into this, because it seems to me that the cities are the ones that are going to do the zoning and things like that. So how does the county get credit or not credit for having these establishments?
Right. So I think that this is probably an area that's going to be explored further by the League of Cities in terms of how this government pool is split up. You know, it's very different for the metro area counties where the cities all have their zoning authority. As compared to the rural counties where there's a real mix, where the counties have retained some of that zoning authority. And I think the idea is that if you have a shop, you have costs that are likely associated with that shop, whether it's a municipal-run shop, a county-run shop, or an independent privately owned shop, and that you are entitled to a percentage of the tax dollars that are collected to support the surrounding needs of that particular use. I think the 50-50 split between the counties and the cities was a quick compromise at the end of last year's legislative session, but will need to be sort of further developed. There's a section of the legislation that talks about that it's really tied to the number of cannabis facilities that are located within your area. So I would see from a practical perspective for a county like Anoka, where many of the cities utilize the sheriff's office resources as their police department, that Anoka will have some costs associated with the broader, you know, if we sort of assume the worst of cannabis retail, that Anoka will and the sheriff's office will have associated costs and staffing needs based upon the sort of implementation of this law, and will be entitled to a portion of those tax dollars to fund that. And the cities will be entitled to a portion of the tax dollars related more to less of the policing issues, but more of the just the day-to-day management issues. I think when you look at a city like Minneapolis, there's a section of the legislation that talks about it's based upon the number of operational retail facilities within the area, how Minneapolis versus Hennepin County is going to work when you have Hennepin County cities that are saying, no, we want one. So is Minneapolis going to take the majority of the dollars? Is Hennepin County going to give those dollars to Minneapolis? I don't think we fully know how that's going to play out at this point in time. I think we just have the sort of skeleton of how the tax side of it is going to work.
So I wanted to tag on to that one because when it says that 20% will go to that local government cannabis aid account, that's what you're talking about, right?
Correct.
And you may not know if this would end up being like we are with fiscal disparities, where we're putting into an account and we're getting nothing back. Do you know what the rules are going to be for that?
We don't know what the rules are, but I think that that's the risk, right? And that's what the league is really advocating for, is more clarity around that side of it, because cities really are bearing the brunt of sort of the how do you see it rolled out? How do you see it moving forward? Because we don't really have good guidance from OCM at this point in time.
Okay.
Well, and I think the thing maybe they're not thinking of, or maybe they are, and they're just being silent on it, is that there's the business side of it, and then there's what people are going to be allowed to do, which without having to pull a permit or pay any fees or do anything like that. And depending on how often people exercise that right, that in itself can present a fairly significant enforcement challenge to a city. So, there's no dollars coming back to help support that. So if the businesses are considered Class 3 commercial, industrial, or utility property, can they only be in a CI district?
So I think if I put my my applicant hat on, I'll make the argument that I'm an agricultural use, and that my agricultural use is just like any other farm that's operating within the city of Columbus, and that, yes, I will have specific standards that are associated. And one of the things we talk about when we talk about consistent uses and permitted uses is that the tax category of a use is not determinative of the underlying use. And so for specificity's sake, our recommendation would be, if you desire to prohibit the development of large farms, significant canopy farms, greenhouse-style farms, that you lay that out in the definitions of your zoning ordinance, so you draw a distinction between existing farming uses and cannabis-style farming uses.
So this Class 3 commercial, industrial, that's a property tax category, not a use category?
It is a specific exemption under the agricultural bill. So for hemp producers, they are not classified as agricultural producers. And
so no green acres for them?
No green, right.
Okay.
So that typically one of the things that so when we look at agricultural uses, many zoning ordinances default back to the ag law. This is exempted from that. So that's what we would point to as saying, but it has not been updated to include cannabis businesses. And so we would recommend that if that's something that the city desires to restrict or put performance standards around within its rural residential district, especially as it becomes a smaller lot residential, as we see more and more smaller lot residential within the city, that there should be good performance standards around any of those uses.
And so the you have to have one, is it one of all those categories, or one? You might have asked this question, but I'm still not clear on it. So one retail, one grower, one manufacturer, or is it one out of the whole bunch of them?
So it's been categorized as one retail, but there is not any prohibiting language. So it specifically says that cities are required to have at least one retail store, and that's laid out within the legislation. I think it's a to be determined on the others, but specifically the sort of the takeaway of the zoning authority is related to the retail use as compared to the other licensing types and uses. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to see. So I believe that the city, based upon, again, no rulemaking coming out and based upon the plain law of the legislation, the city has the authority to restrict those uses, the agricultural uses, some of the manufacturing uses within its zoning ordinance. It does not have the authority to restrict the retail use, except for the one.
I think under your other city code impacts, this isn't really code, but there's going to be a lot of policies that will have to be updated as well, in addition to the codes.
So my other question is, and I'm not sure if you're going to talk about what our next steps are and all of that, because I was wondering if part of that will be doing a study or like pulling information from all these other cities that have already done this, and what are some of the challenges that they've had, and so we can glean some of that information.
Yeah, so if we can move to the slide where we have the zoning updates, a couple of things. So what we will sort of self-initiate at this point in time are the updates to your fee schedule that we want to see adopted prior to January 1. We'll update, sort of any areas, just start adding in those liquor licensing language, the tobacco licensing language, the ability of the city to revoke those licenses if there's a cannabis violation on those properties. We would bring forward a new special event permit for the cannabis style events for the council's consideration at a workshop, and look what that licensing process would look like. So it would be our goal for those things that are really more ministerial and are sort of in the line of making sure that we have our fee structure right, that we're ready, we have the infrastructure in place to deal with the rollout when it comes. We'll calendar those out for your consideration over the course of the next 8 months. But with regards to the zoning updates, those are really core policy conversations. And what our recommendation would be is that this is really the overview of where we are today. It's not tremendously further than where we were when we adopted the moratorium. We will be looking for some of the rulemaking that's coming out of OCM as a mechanism of helping us determine what OCM determines are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions that you would adopt as performance standards within your zoning ordinance. But as those are coming out, we believe that there is a good opportunity for some public engagement on this to see what your existing retailers, your existing license holders. There's no prohibition for a person or store who has a tobacco license, or who already has a tobacco license, who already has an alcohol sales license, to also sell these products. They can all be sold within one facility. We think that from a policy perspective, it would be good to hear sort of those voices and what the guidance is of your existing retailers on what they'd like to see. And then also having your planning staff really engage in the conversation of, here are your industrial CI districts. It's where your research and development facilities would likely be located. It's where they're located for other issues today. Your rural residential, are there performance standards that should be adopted for the farming use or prohibited altogether? And then in your commercial districts, so, we took this is a 5-minute look, but it seems as though, typically what we're seeing cities do, and I would say cities outside of Minnesota, is adopting their retail sales, putting those retail sales locations along significant commercial corridors. And so that pushes you in particular to your general commercial, your highway commercial, and your horse racing districts. As compared, you do have some retail uses that are allowed in the CI and the CI Light District. Those oftentimes interact with your residential surrounding neighborhoods. And so just as a very high-level overview, we would sort of direct you to looking at those particular districts to consider putting the permitted retail use in there.
Can you explain the difference between the hemp business and the cannabis? I don't understand that.
Yeah, I will try. we're now delving into the really hard part of it. So, so since the Farm Bill in 2019, the federal Farm Bill, hemp and THC, so THC is the active ingredient in cannabis that gives the different feeling, just like alcohol, the reason why people use it, whether it's for sleep, whether it's to contemplate the mysteries of the world, I'll just leave it there.
And that's
That's a really nice way.
Isn't that? So the THC ingredient exists and can be activated from a hemp product. Hemp products are legal under federal law, and they're also legal under Minnesota law, and can be purchased today. Cannabis is marijuana, right? It's just the straight form of THC that is regularly utilized, and it has many different varietals. What we're seeing, what's interesting, and I should have just said this when we were talking about the micro and the meso businesses, one of the models that we're seeing coming out of Massachusetts and Colorado is that in order for these types of facilities to really be financially viable and very, where private equity and other funders are really seeking to invest in them, is to have vertical integration. So they grow the product, they manufacture the product, they know exactly the concentration and the experience that the user is going to have, just like a nice slab of Cabernet. There is a very specific experience that is derived from either smoking or eating the different products that are created. And those, we talked to a vertical producer and retail shop owner in Boston, and they are interested in opening facilities here in Minnesota. And they said that they have had, in the first 3 months of opening a new store in Boston, 70,000 customers. So the demand and the access is just is really sort of exponentially growing. I don't know that answered your question, but those are my thoughts. And generally speaking, exactly, there we go. The THC products, the cannabis products, are much stronger. And are not as heavily regulated as the hemp products are today. The other, one of the other things is that there's going to be a lot of labeling requirements, so how much you're taking, when you're taking it, how to take it, guidance around that. But the evidence at this point in time reflects that it's not really possible to overdose on these items.
So it's more medicinal. The hemp is more geared toward pharmaceutical.
No, I think it's just different.
Like 3-2 beer versus.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good analogy. That's a good analogy. Yes.
I only read about that. I don't know that from.
Oh, come on, Janet.
All right, that helps. Thank you.
One other thing I was going to ask is, can we get, or can you point us to where the definitions are for all of the different licensing
Yes,
categories? Because
absolutely.
I'm sure we're going to need that when we're deciding where they're going to be at.
And they're all in the legislation. We'll pull out those definitions and provide them. And it also, within each definition, it specifies what other cannabis-style businesses they can run. So a person who is a cultivator of cannabis can also be a medical hemp producer, but they can't be so you'll see all of those outlined.
And if anyone wanted to know if there was some local interest in this, since the legislation was passed, I believe I've gotten 6 calls from cultivators and manufacturers, no retail stores so far, but we're in a moratorium, so we can't let them know. But there is interest in at least those 2 businesses in this area.
Good to know.
So we do have some model ordinances related to manufacturing from the medical manufacturers. The two licensed medical manufacturers are located within Hennepin County, and the cities where they're located rolled out performance standards related to their use, so particularly with regards to ventilation of the facilities and security protocols and those types of things. So we do have some models that we could utilize, should the council and the planning commission be interested in sort of seeing what that would look like for a manufacturing use.
So one last question. So going back to the, if the city decided to open its own, I think somewhere in here it said you could potentially run into federal law since it's illegal federally, and it could jeopardize access to grant dollars and things like that. How real is that, do you think?
I don't know if City Administrator Davis can opine on this. One of the things that comes to mind is that in most of our federal grants, certainly in all of the ARPA money that we received, is that we are in compliance with broader federal law. Minnesota is unique in the sort of muni model in alcohol. It's one of the sort of last states that provides for that muni model. We are the home of Volstead. Volstead was born in St. Paul. So we have an interesting sort of history with substances and how we legislate around them. We don't have a good answer to that question as of right now, but it's something that certainly, if you look at any of the newspaper articles about Osseo is really the city that's coming out and talking about this and really engaging with it publicly. It's one of the first issues that their city administrator pointed out. It's like, how are they going to manage this? I'm making an assumption, but that this was a specific area of the legislation that allows for cities to take on this role. I would be hopeful that someone might have worked through this from a policy side at the state and would have some guidance for us on what those rules might look like.
And, and I asked the question just because it seems to me that if you had a city, I'm not saying we are that city, but if you had a city who really was strongly opposed to having any of these within their boundaries, one way to get around that is to have your own and keep a very low inventory so nobody would go there. And basically, you meet that requirement, but if by doing that you jeopardize, federal transportation dollars or something, that would not be a good strategy.
And generally, that's the source of most of our grant funds or transportation money. And even when you get money from MnDOT and you assume it's from the state, most of their money's
Comes from the feds, yep.
So you're going to be dealing with them probably on anything you deal with MnDOT.
Well, I hope they don't just sit there and go, well, we'll just have to wait until somebody challenges this and see what the courts come up with. Yeah.
So Megan, this is Rob. I'd heard today that, talking to a building inspector in Wayzata, that possibly they're looking at doing their own city-owned. Have you heard anything about that, or I don't know if Bolton and Mank or your firm contracts with them or has done any research?
Well,
they're one of the bigger
Wayzata,
I wouldn't have thought would have done it. Right?
Wayzata has a very successful muni model, right? Their municipal liquor store is profitable after a pretty significant turnaround in the last 10 years. They've really invested in that, and for those municipalities that already have a municipal liquor store, they can incorporate this use alongside their retail liquor, which makes the lift a lot easier. They don't have to invest in a new building. They don't have to invest in new staff. They have to do some training. They're going to have to do some segmenting of the market, and finding new vendors and things like that. But it's less of a stretch than for a city like Columbus that would need to acquire space or devote some of the existing space to that potential use.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Since we have a large entertainment business in the city, is Running Aces not allowed to have?
They are allowed to be the retail store.
Oh.
So the Racing Commission doesn't weigh in on that? I mean, from a state statute, but I just wonder, like, is there another layer on top of them that would be the Racing Commission to say yes or no, you can do something like that? Because they do weigh in on things that you wouldn't think they would.
Potentially, you know, I think the tribes have been really intentional about creating space for this use associated with other gambling uses that are similarly restricted. So they may benefit from that on the whole. But, you know, I think that the way that OCM is talking about it, I think that the way that the legislation talks about it is that this is not substantially different from alcohol. And so, you know, as from an entertainment perspective, perhaps as flying horses.
Tobacco and alcohol.
So council and the planning commission, so we have to start chipping away or continue chipping away to have this ready by Christmas time, right? January.
That's correct.
So the first question, I think, for everybody to think about, and maybe we should discuss more, is there anybody who thinks the city should, we don't have a municipal liquor store here, that was strongly fought against 30 years ago. Is there anybody who's dying to have a pot shop that the city runs?
At that city run?
Yeah, city runs.
I'll just give my opinion that I wouldn't be in favor of that, just because, to me, it makes more sense to have a business person run a retail store and not government. That just seems like an oxymoron.
Well,
I mean, I know they do municipal liquor, but that seems a little easier than this. If we were in municipal liquor, it would make sense, but we're not, and
Well, that's my thought. You'd have to build a $3 million building,
Yeah.
unless we're going to sell it out of the fire hall or something.
Well, and I don't even know how you can answer that question, because if by doing that, you exempt yourself from federal transportation dollars, I mean, you'd be crazy.
no, I thought the 20% goes into that fund from the taxes that are collected at any retail store in your city.
That's true, but the risk with regards to the federal funding is that you know, sale of cannabis is prohibited under federal law, and when we make an attestation for federal grant dollars that we are in compliance with all federal laws, that we may not be able to fully make that statement and be accurate in it, so that we potentially could have the risk of losing some transportation funding if we operate our own store. That's one of the sort of yet to be determined issues.
We could lose transportation funding if we ran our own store, so that wouldn't make sense.
That's right. I mean, I don't think you can answer the question because there's so many unknowns. If that issue were answered and you knew for sure, that would be one thing, but it's not answered. So you'd be taking a big gamble by moving forward with that, hoping that, you know, they wouldn't enforce or whatever. It would just,
Yeah.
And does Running Aces already have a alcohol license?
Yep, liquor and cigarettes. That would be a nice spot up on that hill there on the freeway, though.
Well, they might
People
even
could see that
build,
coming for 20 miles away.
a separate, you know, they have more money than we do.
Oop. That's accurate. But well, it's
They
up to
might be
them.
interested.
Or Holiday could sell it, right at the Holiday, they sell beer. They could apply for it.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I'd have is, so if, you know, I'm kind of up in the air, very up in the air about the muni style thing, right? And us being responsible for that, and if something goes wrong. But so say we have a business coming to town and they're very successful, and we find out maybe that's something we want to dive into and get those tax dollars coming back to the cities, whether it's for parks or things like that, trails, we want sidewalks. Are we able to just say, change our rules and say, yeah, we want it to be muni and we don't want private sale?
I'll let Jack take this one, or I can take it as well.
It's kind of an either-or thing, you know. You either get in it as a muni and exclude private, or you stay out of it as a muni and allow it to go private sale.
Okay.
Well, but then the trouble is, even if it is profitable, it goes back to the federal laws.
They have to settle that. I
Huh?
mean, I think that has to be settled. I don't know how other cities that are moving forward with this, they're a bigger risk taker than I am. I wouldn't mess with that.
Coming from the city administrator side, you always look for growing revenues outside the levy. And while this may seem like an attractive option, I think it's something that needs to be studied in great detail. And the dialogue can begin tonight, but it's a deep subject, and we're still navigating this thing partially blindfolded again. We don't know all the rules or regulations, so it's something we're going to have to explore as we go along. Maybe the muni is an option. I think just from basic discussion, I don't know if the risk outweigh the rewards, but that's something we'll have to determine.
Right, and we are a small city. No, we're not like any of them that you mentioned.
Right, right.
It could be disastrous for us.
Yeah, I'm just asking the questions more for context, to see how it's working in other areas, not to per se, I'm for having a store here, but not for the muni
city.
style at this point. I just kind of want to know the pros and cons if we move forward, right? Forest Lake, they do it, and next thing you know, we're losing all that revenue to Forest Lake, right? Or Hugo, or Centerville,
Right, we got so many
where they're
around.
way out of the box compared to us, other cities are, for what they accept. So,
All right, so Counselor, do we want to keep exploring, city-owned pot shop, or it doesn't sound like most people are way in favor of it? How much time are we wasting and how much money are we wasting?
I think we're always happy to update you on any sort of evolution that we learn, that we're seeing other cities adopt as part of this process. But from what I'm sort of hearing at the dais tonight, it's that to really focus on looking at your zoning ordinances, your zoning districts, and determining where this is going to best fit for those retail uses and any other performance standards that would be appropriate for the other licensees.
Another question I have, so if somebody's going to fence and grow 40 acres of pot, they have to fence it with a 10-foot fence around it?
Yes, and security and lighting and some of those protocols. So I think Eleanor and I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about this week, but one of the things that we would look to ensuring that that any of the businesses that are operating for this purpose are melding within your existing community is that you're not creating a fortress in the middle of your rural residential district. And so that there would be specific performance standards associated with that use in the CUP for that type of operation. And again, the type of license and the scale of the license has those canopy limits, utilizing the sort of cannabis language. And so the license holder and the type of license will help us determine whether or not it would be a fit for within your existing rural residential district.
so that'd be the rural residential district for business, you're saying? We'd have to work on fitting that into our definition? I'm not really interested in that, having production farmer, right? Unless they have a lot of land, right? But if I got my neighbor that's got 2 acres next to me and he's got a
Close it up.
greenhouse set up, right? I mean, might be an issue.
Yeah, with lights all night
Right.
and burglar alarms and
Right.
blah, blah. That popcorn guy there, he could do that by Thornbeck's. Yeah. Forget the popcorn, so, anyway.
I wonder if deer browse on pot. Just curious
more-
about that. I have a bunch of stone deer running around Columbus.
But
They browse on everything else, so why not that?
No.
that'd be a good thing to steal. Just watch when it's ready or ripe or whatever happens. Go out there at night with some gunny sacks. You could make a year's living in one afternoon, one evening. So you have to have security and lights and fences and dogs and the whole bit. So that kind of changes our rural atmosphere
Right.
in Columbus. Yikes.
You got to look at years ago, when people used to have these farms growing it, I mean, I seen one once that could sit in a pole barn, any one of our pole barns out here, and just run electricity like you wouldn't believe, running grow lights, and, I mean, they get them on windmills, Ferris wheels.
I wonder how many are there already.
I mean, I just look at this as, everybody's got a pole barn. What's going on in the pole barn?
Mr. Mayor, I think somebody may have a question. Did you have your hand up, or are you just stretching?
Do you know how many acres you're gonna be allowed to, how many acres can you grow actually? It's only a very small amount of acres, right?
I don't know, Counselor.
She's looking it up. She's
I'm
looking
looking
through
it
those
up.
150 pages.
Otherwise, it's required to be grown indoors, and that's where it's really expensive. With the outdoors, you can only grow up to like an acre and a half tops. And then you wouldn't want to group everybody together because it just ruin everything anyways.
He'll cross-pollinate.
Yep, so a cultivator that cultivates cannabis in an indoor facility may cultivate up to 30,000 square feet of plant canopy, and an outdoor location may cultivate up to 2 acres of mature flowering plants unless the office increases that limit. The office may increase that limit to no more than 4 acres if the office determines that expansion is consistent with the goals identified in another section of the ordinance. Which we can look at. But again, that would be, part of the city's role here is going to be to say, this is appropriate, this is not appropriate, this meets the goals of the broader legislation. And so, if 2 acres or an acre and a half is okay, from the city's perspective, okay, sounds good. But if more than that, sort of this grants broader discretion to the office to allow up to 4 acres, you would perhaps want a performance standard that would say up to 2 acres for this particular purpose. And from a deliverable perspective, what we can do is sort of getting a sense of where the council and the planning commission is tonight. We can bring back a number of different ordinances, some different language to talk through and to get your guidance on. And hopefully in the timeline in which we do that, we'll continue to gain more information about what other communities are doing as well. And I think we're on the front end of this. We being the cities, we all adopted these moratoriums right about the same time last fall, and now everyone's beginning the sort of planning work of working through their public engagement process on it.
So Megan, do you feel like we as council people and planning commissioners need to be kind of looking for this in other cities and how they're, maybe close cities, how they're developing it and things like that, just so we have context for what we need to do here?
And how close is the league to developing their model ordinance? I think that was kind of brought out when the moratoriums were first passed, or this came up late last summer, that a lot of people were looking to the league for some guidance, at least for a template or a base model to go from. Mm-hmm. So are they anywhere near rolling out a product?
Well, wasn't the league trying to kill it though, weren't they?
Yeah. Well, what's really frustrating is that the legislation, and this was sort of a last add-on. It's interesting to watch how this built over the legislative session last year. But the last add-on was that the Office of Cannabis Management was going to develop the model ordinance. So the league is now saying, well, they're the ones who are going to make the policy on this, when it would be really helpful for the league to sort of step in and to at least put something up for OCM to shoot down. Because again, time, place, and manner restrictions are what's specifically contemplated. I read those as performance standards, but attorney representing a cultivator or a manufacturer may read them as just limitations on the number of hours that they can be open, the type of lights that they can have, that they can be, they must be downcast, they must not, sort of push and create light pollution onto other properties. So there's different interpretations of the legislation that could exist, and it would be good if sort of collectively the cities and the counties could work to flesh all of that out.
And the other point to take into account too is, even though December seems like a long way away. It's going to be a race to get this done to meet this deadline.
Are you thinking of having joint meetings like once a month, or how frequent?
So I think our recommendation would be to start it every other month, so that we really have something substantive to bring to you, and also keeps in mind, all of your time, as well as hopefully moving some of this through the legislative process now that session is well underway, and that would be sufficient in order to get this before you. The things that will come before council, like the fee schedule, all of that, we'll just get on our timeline for drafting.
Okay, thank you. A lot of good information. Thank you for putting that all together.
Any other questions, anyone?
And always feel free to shoot out an email or to ask us with any follow-up questions.
Thanks.
Well, good luck with this. Huh? Holy smokes.
Roll out.
Oh, what a lot of work.
What's next?
Okay.
On to number 7. This is a discussion about the approval policy for Planning Commission public hearing recommendations. So, Jack, why don't you go ahead and start in?
Thank you, Jesse. Due to the nature of some of the short turnaround times from Planning Commission public hearings to getting something to City Council for approval, taking into account expediting the approval process for applicants, sometimes this time interval is not adequate to have thorough investigations. With that in mind, we've kind of developed a draft policy for your consideration to establish procedures for the Planning Commission, and so that the applicants will know exactly what they're facing when it comes to approvals that do require public hearings. That was emailed out to you earlier this afternoon. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it or not. But basically, what it's asking or requiring is that there be 2 Planning Commission reviews of things that go to a public hearing. When the public hearing is held, the Planning Commission will take comments on that and review that with the applicant, go over, ask any other questions, inform the applicant that it will be brought before the next Planning Commission before a recommendation is made. And it gives some outlines as to what the procedures are and the exceptions and the implementation. It does provide for exceptions for things that are time sensitive in nature, things that affect public life, safety, and health, and also those things that need to be done in a time sensitive manner. I think the example that we used in a previous discussion, if Google came here and said, we're going to build a campus in Columbus, but we need an answer next week, I think we would probably make an exception to that policy. So you have before you what that is, and we're just asking for some discussion on it. In the event there's desire of the City Council to act on this tonight and there's a vote, only the City Council members can vote on this. We are requesting that the Planning Commission gives any comments or reviews on what's before you.
Okay, so we've had situations where it was helpful to postpone it for 2 weeks, but then I feel like there's been meetings where postponing it for 2 weeks is just irritating the applicant when it's clear cut dry. So is there a leeway here? If it's policy, is it policy on all of them? Or can we use our discretion? Because we did have, at our last joint meeting, somebody come and give an awesome presentation, come to the Planning Commission meeting, and I didn't realize that they wanted us to postpone it another 2 weeks, but there was no reason to. They met everything, the conditions by the staff was all there, so I don't want to feel like people to feel like we're giving them the runaround, and I think it would have been uncalled for to put that person off another 2 weeks.
And, you know, I think you have a good point there, Lynn. I think the important thing to make this work, if this is what the council wants to adopt, is to make sure there's good communication with the applicant up front over what the time frame is. So they'll know going in that they submit, there's going to be a public hearing. The public hearing is just to take comments on and then have another 2 weeks to examine this more thoroughly if necessary. At the end of that 2 weeks, at the next planning commission meeting would be the time when a recommendation was made and approved to send to city council. There are things though outside the public hearings that are maybe simpler matters that this doesn't address. This just addresses those things that require public hearings. So I think it's just a matter of how it's handled, and the applicant needs to be informed up front of the schedule. Regardless, I think you'll always have some people that have some complaints about that, but I think if people know up front what the schedule is, it'll be a lot easier to manage.
Well, the one issue we had, it really wasn't with the business owner herself. It was with the property owner who has tried before to get somebody in there, and it was just getting him taken care of. Because I mean, we were all fine voting to recommend that instance to the council. And so I just think but now the last issue we had, it worked out where we put it off 2 weeks because we didn't have everything we needed we needed that 2 weeks to get everything together, so.
Can I make just one comment? Just in my opinion, I like having the extra 2 weeks, and if it's in the policy, then we are letting them know that this is the timeline and they need to plan accordingly. I'm sure there are times where the Planning Commission doesn't see any issues and they want to move it forward, but there might be something else that one of the council members sees that they want to research. And I think that would help. I think it would help the council probably more than anything to have those extra 2 weeks to after hearing, because it might spur another question like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I'm going to go explore, that piece or something. So
And I get that, but in that case, if you have something after the public hearing, they come before you in a week, so there's still time.
if you have a week,
If
you're not too busy.
Right, so.
And I think a lot of the questions that we might have would require staff to, investigate. So it's not just that we would have a week, it's that, now I have 3 questions, it's going to staff, they're getting it on maybe Thursday or Friday because you just had your meeting on Wednesday. They're trying to get their packets out, they're trying to plan for the council meeting. It just becomes really difficult. And I think, the example that you bring up, Lynn, I think is a really good one because to what Elizabeth told me, that applicant and the property owner had been told it was going to be a 2-week time. So they had planned on that.
Okay.
And they were okay with it. And I think that, some of the questions that came up were questions that would have better been, talked about within the planning commission, and there would have been time to we didn't have time to fully investigate them. The fact that there was going to be 2 separate businesses on that property, nobody knew that till it came to the council.
And that's, I'm just saying, sometimes there's an instance where we don't need to put them off 2 weeks. I know better than anything, me and Barb, because we get our packet on Friday, and we were busting our butt to go out before Wednesday to look at property where, it does give us more time. I'm just saying, I don't think there are some cases where we're ready and we feel ready, and that's what a planning commission is supposed to do, is have a public hearing. Do you feel confident? If you don't and there's more questions, then you put it off. It's, to me, if you want to make a policy, I'll follow it. To me, it's micromanagement of a planning commission that you appointed to do a job, and we bust our butt to go out and look at properties and look everything up in the book and point things out that we would have, come with questions, and then if it's gonna be 2 weeks, then we don't have to,
You don't have to go so
Hustle.
hard, yep. Okay, well, it comes down to a couple of things. Jack and Eleanor, when these people show up, or applicant arrives at the counter, if they are clearly told it'll be Wednesday night to give your spiel, 2 more weeks, come on back, and then you guys send it up in a week. So that's only 5 weeks, right?
Well, actually, it could be 3 weeks, because it would be the
One.
date of the public hearing.
Yep.
It's 2 weeks before the next planning commission, and then 5 days after that, it would go to city council. So it'd be less than 3 weeks. It'd be 19 days in the whole process.
And then it's on you guys to make sure they understand it. And also, and it was like this years and years ago, 30 or 40 years ago. And then it got tightened up a little bit. And for the same reason you're saying, to make it easier on the clients, on the applicants. But then, I think we should go back to it. And if there's something, if they have to have the council vote by midnight tomorrow, or they lose their money or lose their deal or something, we can always have a special meeting. Or we could have, there's ways in a special case to really do it.
And that's one of the things that was pointed out in here. There's going to be 4 times a year where there could be a 3-week interval. That's when you have 5 Wednesdays in a month. So in that period of time, like you said, Jesse, you can call a special meeting to address those time-sensitive issues.
And we did come up with things for that kitty cat deal. So if she buys that building, she's a nonprofit. So here's a nice piece of, I don't know if the vote would have changed, a nice piece of commercial property. That could have been a pot shop. And instead it might be a nonprofit kitty cat house. And that's kind of stupid of us. But nobody thought of it until after you guys were done. And then I thought, wait a minute, what happens if, but anyway. So I think for those reasons, let's try it.
Well, how do the rest of the planning commissioners feel about it?
Yeah, how do you guys feel about it?
Well, I think it's okay. I understand that the time between our meeting and your meeting is very short. If there are problems, it gives us more time to do more research. And that was one of the cases recently with the septic and so forth. We did need more time to find out all of the facts on that particular problem. But there are, like, it's when we have variances and so forth, I can't see dragging that out for 3 weeks,
But we don't have to on variances, right?
Well,
They'd have a
right now
public
it's written
hearing.
as anything that has a public hearing, so.
So one of the considerations that I would put to the broader group is that consistency in your policy and practice is important from a legal perspective when an application is challenged. And so whether it's an application that everyone wholly supports, or perhaps it's an application that has a lot of public opposition, making sure that your process is consistent between those two applications is an important sort of legal characteristic. And one of the things that this policy outlines is that the Planning Commission documents their findings and submits those to the City Council. And in the context where Planning Commission does not support an application and is saying, we find that this particular development would harm the public health, safety, and welfare. This particular development, we are recommending denial to the City Council because we do not believe that it meets the purpose of the ordinance, that it violates our performance standards, whatever that case may be. Your legal counsel would always recommend that staff draft those findings for review and consideration as part of the public record. And in order to sort of put boots and suspenders around the worst case scenario, we like to apply it to the best case scenario as well, so we can create consistency whenever we're looking at the policy making that you all are doing.
And just to talk about the turnaround time, just one other thing is that city staff only has 2 days, actually a day and a half, to turn something around from the planning commission decision on a Wednesday night to get the packets out to city council on a Friday afternoon. Or if they don't get it out then, it has to come out as an amendment on Monday or Tuesday, which gives them less time. And then they only have 5 days in after the meeting too to absorb all that information. So I understand that, not everything's a one-size-fits-all, but I think overall this may produce and give everybody a little bit more time to thoroughly investigate some of these matters.
If I could speak on the staff turnaround thing, just that's my perspective on this. The delaying of it to 2 planning commission meetings does not change the staff turnaround from that second planning commission meeting to that next council meeting, but it does give you more time in the interim to get a lot of that investigation done, so it's not all on me on Thursday to figure out everything the council wants to know from that public hearing, as long as it happens in the 2 weeks between the public hearing and the second planning commission meeting. But if I get it all on Thursday, sometimes I cannot physically get it out to the council in packets on Friday.
Anybody else? Ladies? You're fine with it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Lynn, can we try it?
Right.
Yeah?
Go for it.
Well, I want you to be happy you're the chairwoman.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to know if we had leeway on something that is cut and dry and we didn't feel like we needed to.
So I do have one question, just because of that. So say the planning commission feels like it's a no-brainer and they have no other, can they go ahead and make the recommendation, but still it'll be the 2 weeks lag before the council, actually it would be 3 weeks, that it would go to the city council?
The way this policy is written, that would be the case. It would still be the 2 weeks unless you develop some type of standards for granting that additional exception.
But one of the things that we haven't, it's not black and white in this policy, but it came up prior to your time as being chair, Lynn, was that, there was a time where we had a planning commission and a lot of them were new and they worked really hard and they would come up with a recommendation and then it would go to the council and the council would completely go off in a different direction. And they were feeling very frustrated with us. And so the idea behind this is also that those questions that we might come up with, that the staff would investigate, that information comes back to you for your discussions, so that you've got the information just like you have the findings and everything else, and then you can make a decision, and then ideally we're not going off like this on our, and because I think that's the most frustrating for applicants. They come forward, they have their public hearing, they hear the discussion, it's like, oh, the planning commission loves us, so they come to the council and it's like, well, what about this, or what about this, or what about this, and they're like, I thought this was a slam dunk. This would give them a more consistent experience, and as is appropriate in my mind, the information, just like any of the findings that the staff have, go back to the planning commission so that you can incorporate that into your recommendation. And so it's not meant to micromanage, it's meant to really augment the information that you're getting from other sources.
So,
Right, but I think sometimes the planning commission doesn't get those questions from you guys.
From the council.
Right. There's no, you've got a liaison there. So if there is something, either the liaison should mention it during, the meeting, will you look into this or that, or we have these concerns? And quite frankly, we haven't received that lately.
Well, and I think that's actually a really good point, Barb, because when, most of us either are sitting out there or are on Zoom watching it, right? But we're there as members of the public. And so what we've been instructed is that you don't weigh in as members of the public because no other member of the public get to. The person that's sitting up here as your liaison doesn't know what we're thinking out there, right? And we don't really have a way to text them or try to telepathically let them know, hey, you need to ask this question. I'm just picking on you because you are currently.
No, I get it.
So I guess the idea is that, and this last one's a good example. You know, there's 5 questions that I came up with afterwards. I talked to Dean, I talked to the attorney, went to Eleanor, and then you're getting all that information back. I don't know that you necessarily get it back as saying, you know, the council had these questions and here are the answers, but you're getting additional information back. I think if it's helpful for you to know that they were, you know, they were questions that came up from the council, it could be formatted that way.
Right, that's what we need, is your input. You're the ones making the decision. And if we walk out and somebody says, you didn't ask enough questions. Okay, what questions do you need? That needs to be, you know.
But I can see where it worked, because our last gentleman, the last public hearing we had, we waited 2 weeks. We were able to ask for more information.
Right.
But I'm just, not everything is that big. So I just didn't know if we had leeway on a variance just to recommend it, or do we have to put it off 2 weeks, you know, something like that. But the last one, it did help to have 2 weeks. So it's not a bad thing.
I
No, it's
think
fine.
consistency is the answer here.
Right,
Let's
so we
do it the
just do
same
it to
way
everybody,
every time.
and
Everybody goes 2 weeks.
that's how it is.
Whether we need the time or not, we need to be consistent on
Yeah.
what we're doing so that somebody doesn't say, well, I thought it'd be done in one setting, or I thought I had to wait 2 weeks. And the answer is,
Right.
you're right, you had to wait 2 weeks. And
Right.
we need to have that definitive answer.
And you've got a good point, Robin, and again, that starts with the first discussion that the applicant has with city staff, that they're informed of the timeline in the process of how long it's gonna take.
And we need the input from the council, whether you just want to call one of us and tell us so that we can pass on the information. What are your concerns that we have not covered? Because we can't think of everything during
Yeah,
that
and
initial.
maybe the council should be putting, so whoever our liaison is for that session, we feed our questions to the liaison and they forward it to the planning commission.
Right.
But, I mean, this last example, that wasn't how it worked. I mean, the questions
I'm saying
came
going
mostly
forward.
from me. They went back to, you know, for instance, the question that Robin asked during the meeting, but he didn't get an answer. And I went back to Dean, it's like, why didn't you answer? And that was a legitimate question. I have the same question. We need the answer to that.
Right.
And plus X, Y, Z, all these other things. I don't know, you know, by writing those down and giving them back to the planning commission, you guys are gonna have to go back to, you know, the attorney, the planners, the staff to get their answer anyway. So it seems to me like that's not a very efficient way to communicate the information. And I think the same is true with the liaison. The liaison is there during the meeting to help answer any questions you might have, or if, for instance, some, you know, we put that in place when there were some, you know, workshops and things that were going on that you guys weren't part of, but that impacted our answers to some of those things. So the liaison can say, oh, you know, by the way, we've been working on this, and, you know, I'm thinking this isn't going to fly, or, you know, provide additional information. But I don't think it's their job to answer all of the questions that we have. But I do think it's possible for us, once the questions are answered, that there could be an email from Eleanor or whatever that went out and said, here's some additional questions that came from the council, question, answer, question, answer. It will get incorporated into the memo, but that way it's clear to you where it came from. And,
Right,
yeah.
because we're having a discussion.
Yep.
We're not having the discussion the day of the meeting.
Yeah. And, you know, if we could all just talk to each other and not be called out on open meeting law, it'd be a heck of a lot easier. But, you know, you can't do that. So this is the merry-go-round we get to be on.
I can certainly serve as the middleman in this, where you forward all your questions to me, and then as a part of the packet for the next planning commission meeting, it is a combination of all of the questions that have been asked, along with answers from me and whoever else I needed to reach out with. And that can be a part of the memo for the second planning commission meeting, if we just institute that as like how it moves forward.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Would you be able to get those questions back to the applicant as well, so that they could be prepared for that following meeting, that, hey, I'm gonna get hit with these questions, and I need to have an answer ready for these questions?
Absolutely.
To help that process move smoothly.
Right.
Yep, so as part of the preparing for the second planning commission meeting after the public hearing. Have the questions that have been asked, answers, the ones that I don't have answers for that will need to be asked of the applicant, then we can bring that up so that they have those
Yes.
answers for that discussion the next week.
You could, I don't know if you could even go one step further and say if you don't, the applicant doesn't have the questions and answers back to you by a deadline, that they're getting bumped to the next meeting because they're not prepared.
That's exactly what should have happened at the last meeting where we didn't have answers about the septic.
Sure.
And where.
And the
what else?
well,
Yeah,
right.
and all of that. And Lynn was going to postpone that meeting, but we were advised to just push it through.
By Dean, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I understood
So
too.
that right there, it cuts you off at your knees, like, oh, wait a minute, I thought I could ask these questions, and then you get told, no, you
Yeah,
can't.
you wanted to put some sort of conditions in there, and then you were told, well, the
So we
council
need
needs to
something
do it. but-
uniform, so that we're not in the middle of a meeting, so, no. He asked about the screening, he got cut right off, there's a 20-foot,
This will fix that.
well,
Okay, let's just do this.
All right. So I'll make a motion to approve the approval policy for the Planning Commission public hearing recommendations as exhibited under the same title in the February 21st, 2024 amended agenda materials for this item. Is there a second?
I will
Oh,
second.
has to be a,
Has to be a council.
Oh,
This is Janet, I'll second.
has to be a board member. So now, board members can vote.
Rob, aye.
Janet, I.
Sue, I.
Ron, aye.
And Jesse, aye.
Okay.
So we got 2 more
New
weeks.
Policy.
New policy in 2 more weeks. So how do you feel about this,
Adjournment?
Counselor? Is that a good choice?
I like this choice.
Huh?
Makes me very happy. I like it as well. It does. It soothes my counselor heart. And it also, I very much like you utilizing your staff as your mechanism of communication. I tell the planning commission liaison, who's also a member of council, send them their questions. I said, open meeting law, open meeting law.
And one thing that you made me think of, which I hadn't thought of, so the meeting's on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Thursday, and then you have to have this all sifted, sorted, and
Yes.
printed.
And new conditions, new findings of fact, answers for all the questions, Friday morning.
Because I just didn't realize it was that short a time in between, so let's try it.
So we
And as long as you,
when
Council.
public hearings are scheduled, I send them a big, complete letter, which has the dates of the meetings. Currently, it's funky because we have like the public hearing, and then there's multiple options where it might go on this date and then to the city council, or it might go straight to the city council the next week. But this would make it a lot easier to say, here are your 3 meeting dates and who they are with.
thumbs up.
all right, number 8, Planning Commissioners Report. Robin, anything to report?
Not a thing.
Anything?
No, sir.
No, sir?
Nope,
Barb?
nope.
No?
Sweet.
We got a quiet group tonight.
Motion to adjourn.
No, we have to have
Oh,
I go
City Administrators Report.
Nice try, Rob.
yeah, I know. I was hoping to see my kids.
We'll save that report until the council meeting next week.
All right, Planning and Zoning Tech Report.
I'm just going to keep bothering you all about your books. If you have a physical copy of your book, bring it in whenever. I see Sue brought hers, and I will get it updated. If you want a physical one and you don't have one, let me know. I will get you one, because we have new books. I also have 2 large maps of the city of Columbus that is open for 2 of you to take if you would like them. Rob, you want one? That's one.
Yes, please.
I think I have one.
I have one.
Yep, mine.
I've got one.
Okay. The second one goes to me. I will put that up on my wall, but that's all that I have for this meeting.
All right, now we're ready for a motion.
You want me to make that motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
And seconded, and call for the vote.
Rob, aye.
Janet, I.
Barb, aye.
Lynn, I.
Sue, I.
Bethany, aye.
Ron, aye.
Bob and I.
And Jesse, aye. Our meeting is adjourned.